This is the city of Dublin. Today Dublin is one of the most famous cities in Europe and a popular tourist destination, attracting thousands of visitors every year to its sites. But in 1916, this city was the base of one of the most well-known uprisings in the history of Ireland. It was the base of the 1916 Easter Rising. As an MA history student, I feel that the Easter Rising is an important event in the history of modern Ireland. With this in mind, and in the spirit of it being the year of its centenary, I have decided to travel to Dublin to visit the sites associated with the Easter Rising, to help me get a better understanding and widen my knowledge of the event. As I sit on the train and look out into the countryside, I think about the talks I had with my fellow MA students on what their views and opinions were on the Easter Rising as an important event in Irish history.
Yeah, I think the Easter Rising is really important for the study of Irish history. I mean, it's a turning point in Irish history. It's a time when, Ireland have decided they've had enough. They no longer want to sit back and be under English rule, a rule that they've had forced upon them for hundreds of years.
The Easter Rising of 1916 is very important to our study of Irish history as it emphasises different elements such as class conflict and culture and politics. It showed how in 1916 Irish identity was very strong and people felt the only way to freely express their identity was to remove British rule from Ireland.
As someone who studies gender history, I think the Easter Rising is incredibly important. It showed that women could fight on the same level as men. The Cumann Ban were incredibly important. They were trained in gunfights and running arms. This is something that was incredibly important because it showed that women weren't delicate and they could fight in something as violent as the Easter Rising.
As an event in Irish history, I feel it is very important because as a world event it became known through the theatrical nature of the Rising, from the setting of the GPO, which was acting as a stage, to Patrick Pearse's proclamation speech, and all the way up to the events of Easter week and their subsequent execution of their leaders.
I think as students of Irish history, it's difficult to not have at least a passing interest in the intense historiographical debate which seems to follow the Rising around, and the centenary of the Rising seems to have revived this historiographical debate somewhat.
It's probably one of the most significant events in the last 100 years, in more ways than one, in terms of economic change, social change, and of course political change. It's been very significant in more recent times with centenaries and things.
I think it's essential to study 1916 and the Easter Rising when looking at Irish history because it is such a turning point in the history of Ireland, in the history of the country.
Well, I think the Easter Rising is important for Irish historians to study because it brings together a lot of different strands, viewpoints and personalities. So for instance, you've got Catholic nationalism of Pearse, you've got the old Republican Fenian tradition of Tom Clarke, and you've got the Anglo-Irish tradition of Irish nationalism as well through the likes of Casement and Childers.
Personally, I think that the Easter Rising is important to the study of Irish history and history in general, as it's a turning point in Irish society that people can relate to. It's the study of society where our parents grew up, our grandparents grew up, as opposed to the more traditional and older society that we might not be as in tune with.
I believe that the Easter Rising is extremely important for any history student, whether they're at GCSE level, A level, or university level.
As I arrive in Dublin, I continue to reflect on the statements given by my fellow MA students, and from their statements I believe that there can be no doubt that as an event the Easter Rising was important in the context of Irish history. My first stop in Dublin is here at O'Connell Street, and more specifically the General Post Office, or the GPO as it is more commonly known. And it was here at the GPO that the main events of the Rising took place. As I stand outside and look upon this building, I can't help but be somewhat amazed that it was here that Patrick Pearse read out the proclamation that he hoped would establish Ireland as a republic. I have here in my hand a copy of the proclamation. It's certainly republican in its content. Promises that were included within the proclamation were civil and religious liberties, equal rights, and equal opportunities for all Irish citizens.
Of course, we all know that the Easter Rising was not a success. It lasted from Easter Monday, the 24th of April, until the following Saturday, the 29th of April, when Pearse and the leaders were arrested and executed.
Taking into consideration that the rebellion was short-lived, it is important to think about just how much of a turning point was the Easter Rising in the context of Irish history.
So it was the first time that a large armed rebellion had taken place against the active Union and the British state.
I think importantly it represented the beginning of a shift from constitutional nationalism to militant republicanism, particularly as they moved from home rule to full-fledged independence. I feel it represents the foundation moment for the Irish state. It's about the nearest equivalent to an Independence Day as you can get in Ireland, given that even though the Free State was to come into existence after the end of the Civil War, the difficult legacy of that sort of means that most people look back to this as the beginning of the Irish Republic.
And it also hardened attitudes both within Unionist and Nationalist camps. Some people would argue that this was the beginning of, partition.
It was a crucial turning point in Ireland's fight for independence. It was a catalyst for subsequent events, including Sinn Féin's landslide victory and the War of Independence.
From the Easter Rising, then we go to the War of Independence, which eventually led to an independent Ireland, but partition of Northern Ireland, which still affects the country today. And then it also led to the Civil War, which affects current Irish politics.
For me, the real flip moment of the Irish separatist project, so to speak, was the World War I conscription crisis, which came to a head in 1918. But this allowed Sinn Féin to mobilise and also to profit electorally in the general election of 1918.
But I think actually if you contextualise it in its own time, it was such a huge turning point, as were other events at that time, in terms of social context, economic context, and of course political.
In reality, the Easter Rising was a small event, it was a small revolt. It involved 1,500 people, it was quashed in a week, and there was 450 casualties, many of which were civilians. What I think does make it a significant turning point was the fact that the British state savagely executed 16 members of the revolt, and it was that martyrdom that I think gave the Easter Rising the platform that it enjoys today.
If you think about in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, when the rebels were surrendered and were being led away by the British Army through the streets of Dublin, many of the ordinary citizens of Dublin were shouting abuse at them, they were spitting at them because they were so unpopular. And attitudes really don't start to change until the executions, which come in the months after the Easter Rising.
So it was here at Kilmainham Jail that the leaders of the Rising were imprisoned and subsequently executed. And although today it is no longer an active prison, I still feel the memory of 1916 looms over it.
As I gaze upon the exterior of the jail, I think about what my fellow MA students said about the executions being the most important aspect of the Rising. And by just reflecting on this aspect of the Rising, I can't begin to imagine the brutality of the executions. My final stop in Dublin is here at the Garden of Remembrance. As I walk through this beautiful place and gaze upon this magnificent sculpture, as well as the wreath laid to mark the centenary of the Rising, I can't help but think just what sort of a legacy has the Easter Rising left us, and is its impact still felt today?
In my opinion, the Easter Rising still has a huge psychological impact on us 100 years later. Today we still see armed Republican groups who seek legitimacy from the men of 1916, not to mention various political parties from across the island of Ireland who profess to be proponents of the ideals of 1916.
We still have a North of Ireland, we still have a Republic of Ireland and a very clear border. This obviously stemmed from the impact that the Rising had.
I think it's in more recent times it's been the most significant catalyst for what's happened here in Ireland, and the fact that we even are talking about it today as historians and that it is such a significant centenary, I think just shows the importance and the significance of it in in the scheme of Irish history.
In the long term, the Easter Rising endows the Republican tradition with a very important, influential symbol that it hasn't really had since 1798. And I mean, if you go into West Belfast today and look at the murals relating to historical subjects, they will either relate to the Troubles themselves in the late 20th century, or they'll relate to 1798, or more importantly, the Easter Rising. There won't be anything about the Young Irelanders in 1848 or the Fenians in 1867. So in that respect, I think it's important.
It's also an event which has been politicised both by Unionists and Nationalists. For example, it's been used in recent Sinn Féin election literature. So it's an event which has become both glorified and politicised over time.
A lot of the more extreme leaders in the Indian independence movement took a lot of example from the Irish independence movement. And in that, they saw what the leaders were doing, what they were saying, how they were trying to accomplish their goals. So people who were leading other independence movements really saw that and thought, okay, there's something that we can gain from studying this movement.
Very crucially, it poses a very difficult question about the use of violence in the course of Irish history, and about how successful violence actually is in the context of Ireland. As even though it was a military failure, the blood sacrifice at the time and the subsequent Irish Revolution did more essentially than 70 years of constitutional nationalism, and that's very difficult for a lot of people to come to terms with even now, 21st century in Ireland.
If anything, I think it's helped Ireland deal with the way that it looks at social conflict, and in more recent times has held kind of an understanding for circumstances, how they arise and how we're going to move forward from them.
It was a political event of enormous emotional power, and in my opinion, it is important for any student who has only ever known an independent Irish state to understand the fears of the leaders and how they feared for Ireland's survival and its state of nationhood. And I believe it is very important to understand the history of Ireland today.
I think a lot of Irish Americans see that as something that's really important to who we are and how we've gotten to this point today.
It's also heavily connected to the themes of Irish patriotism and nationalism, and the emotive connection that Irish people have with their country, the idea that they've fought for what they have, again apparent in centenary celebrations. I think the fact that Patrick Pearse and James Connolly are still quoted today represents these themes and epitomises how much impact that these emotive events can hold for Irish society.
I think the way that we are commemorating it 100 years on definitely shows that the Irish people and Irish society as a whole still holds the Easter Rising as something that was really important to Irish history.
I think particularly as historians, it's important that we remember that significance, and the fact, of course, that we're still talking about it is significant in itself.
So it's very important to study it as history students, as we see there's also elements within the 1916 Rising that can be explored, because it's often pigeonholed as an Irish Catholic nationalist event, but it wasn't. So we can see that there was also reactions from people such as Unionists, women, the British Army and the general public, so we can get a wider understanding of the event as we study it.
It has been stated by certain scholars that the best way to develop a better understanding of an event from the past is to visit the site where an event took place. Overall, being able to come down to Dublin and visit the sites associated with the Easter Rising has really brought my knowledge of the event to a whole new level. But for others, does the memory of 1916 still hang over these places?
I think undoubtedly it does. I have attended both recently, and I think they are places of great inspiration. I think they are places of great education and educational possibility.
When I think of Dublin now and think of a bustling O'Connell Street lined either side with shops, I cannot imagine that 100 years ago it was in smithereens. We've managed to put all of that behind us in 100 years and rebuild a city that is Dublin, that is, you know, the hub of Ireland that attracts so much tourism. And, you know, in a way, we should really be plugging 1916 a lot more for tourism factor, if anything else.
I think in regards to O'Connell Street, I have been to O'Connell Street, and I think, you know, I would believe that it was a sign of the Easter Rising. I mean, the bullet holes are still very prevalent. one thing I would say to you, it's like any area of history, it changes, the landscape changes, and it's about you, and it's about recapturing what you believe happened on the day. And I think if you have a vision, you can pretty much imagine it. I know I could.
From the interviews that I have conducted with my fellow MA history students here at Queen's, it is clear that 100 years on, the Easter Rising is an important topic in Irish history for both staff and students within the history department. Not only is it a topic of great fascination among students, but also one that they can chat about and also have a good discussion about.
Do I believe the Easter Rising was an important event in Irish history? Yes. Do I believe that it is a vital topic to study in Irish history? Yes. And do I believe that its impact is still felt today? Yes. And while 100 years on, there is no one left alive who can remember the Easter Rising firsthand, I believe the memory of the Easter Rising is very much alive in 2016.